content warning. This episode contains historical accounts involving the deaths of children and description of violence that some listeners may find distressing. Listener discretion is advised. History remembers monsters, but it does not remember them evenly. Some names are preserved with careful detail, their actions recorded, their cruelty documented, their reputations reinforced across generations. Others are shaped more gradually, altered by rumor, repetition, and a subtle influence of those who benefit from a particular version of events being believed. Over time, the line between what was done and what was said to have been done begins to blur. Accounts conflict, motives shift, stories grow sharper at the edges and darker at the center. What remains is not always a clear record, but something more complex, a figure suspended between history and legend, where truth and narrative have become difficult to separate. And once that transformation begins, it rarely reverses. A person becomes a symbol. A life becomes a warning. A name becomes inseparable from the story history chooses to remember. There are some stories that arrive already bearing their teeth. Before we know the names, before we know the dates, before we know the shape of the land or the weight of the winter, we know the ending that history prefers. A beast moved through the countryside. Children vanished. Bodies were found torn open. And somewhere in the space between the forest and the village, between hunger and superstition, between what people feared and what they could prove, a man became a monster. In the old imagination of Europe, the werewolf was not just an animal. It was a violation. It was the collapse of all the borders people depended on to keep the world understandable. The border between man and beast, between Christian and damned, between wilderness and civilization, between appetite and atrocity. A wolf was dangerous enough, but a man who could become a wolf was something worse, because he suggested that savagery did live only in the dark woods beyond the village. It lived in the human body itself. And in the 16th century, that idea was not treated as poetry, it was treated as a possibility. Long before modern horror turned the werewolf into a creature of moonlight and cinema, courts in Europe were hearing cases against men and women accused of transforming into wolves and mutilating children. France became one of the great theaters of that fear. Trials spread across the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. Confessions were drawn out beneath torture, stories of ointments and demonic pacts circulated through villages and courts. And the line between criminal violence and supernatural explanation blurred until one became almost inseparable from the other. Historians now see many of these cases as mixtures of folklore, coercion, social panic, and, in some instances, genuine murder. But at that time, the werewolf was not merely a legend. It was an belief alone does not explain why these trials spread as far as they did. Europe had lived with stories of werewolves for centuries, but stories alone do not bring people into courtrooms. Something else was happening. Across parts of France, accusations of witchcraft, fears of demonic influence, religious upheaval, famine, and recurring violence were creating a world in which extraordinary explanations no longer seemed extraordinary. When a child disappeared, people did not simply wonder who might have committed the crime. They wondered what kind of thing could have committed it. That distinction is easy to dismiss from the distance of the 21st century, but it was not irrational within the world they inhabited. Wolves were real. Child mortality was tragically common. Disease arrived without warning. Harvests failed. War disrupted ordinary life. Much of existence already felt balanced on the edge of forces people could neither predict nor control. In a world that regularly produced suffering without obvious explanation, supernatural answers often felt no less reasonable than natural ones. It was within that atmosphere that one particular case began to take shape. It did not begin with a confession or a trial. It began the way so many historical nightmares begin, with frightened families, missing children, and a community slowly realizing that something was hunting at the edges of the world they believed they understood. Because the werewolf is not a creature that lives entirely outside us. The figure of the werewolf has endured for centuries because it occupies a unique, unsettling place in the human imagination. Unlike dragons or demons, it begins as something familiar: a neighbor, a husband, a traveler. Someone who belongs to the community until, suddenly, they do not. The transformation is frightening not simply because a man becomes a beast, but because it suggests that the beast was never entirely absent to begin with. Stories embody that fear more completely than the case that emerged near the town of Dole in 1573. It is a story preserved through legal records, folklore, and centuries of retelling, each version adding another layer to a mystery that has never been fully solved. Whether Gilles Garnier was a murderer, a mentally broken man, a victim of panic, or something far more complicated remains impossible to answer with certainty. What survives instead is the story history chose to remember. And that is what brings us to Dole. To a hermit on the edge of society, to children found butchered in the countryside, to a confession that claimed a specter, an ointment, and a body that could become something else. And to one of the most infamous names in the history of lycanthropy, Gilles Garnier, the Werewolf of Dole. To understand the story of Gilles Garnier, it helps to begin not with the man himself, but with the world that was prepared to believe him. 16th century Eastern France was not the orderly, rational landscape later centuries like to imagine themselves inheriting. This was a world of small villages and hard winters, of forests that still felt spiritually crowded, of religious unease, political strain, crop failures, disease, and the constant vulnerability of ordinary life. In that world, wolves were not distant symbols. They were real predators, woven into daily fear. They stalked roads and the edges of settlements, and carried a power in the popular imagination far greater than the animal alone. The wolf represented hunger from outside. The werewolf represented hunger from within. That distinction was not simply poetic. It reflected the way medieval and early modern Europeans understood the world around them. Nature was not viewed as something separate from humanity, but as part of a divinely ordered creation in which every living thing occupied its proper place. Villages represented order. Fields represented labor. Churches represented salvation. Beyond those familiar spaces lay the forest, a place that seemed to resist human control. It was where travelers disappeared, bandits hid, wolves hunted, and stories took on lives of their own. Every journey beyond the edge of the village meant stepping into a landscape where the ordinary rules of society felt increasingly fragile. For people living in the Franche-Comté region, this was not abstract fear passing down through folklore. It was reinforced by experience. Wolves remained a genuine threat throughout much of rural France, particularly during harsh winters when prey became scarce. Livestock losses were common enough to shape local economies, and attacks on isolated travelers or children, while uncommon, were believable enough that they rarely required embellishment. The danger did not have to be constant. It only had to be possible. Life in this part of France was measured less by calendars than by harvests. Every season carried its own uncertainty, and survival often depended upon factors no individual family could control. A spring frost could destroy crops before they matured. Heavy rains might rot grain in the fields. Disease could sweep through livestock with little warning. Even years that escaped outright disaster often left families balancing on the edge of scarcity. Hunger shaped daily life in ways that are difficult to appreciate from the modern world. It influenced where people traveled, how long food supplies lasted, which animals were slaughtered, and whether children had enough to eat through the winter. A failed harvest was not merely an economic setback. It became a crisis that rippled through every household, weakening bodies, spreading illness, and forcing impossible choices about how limited resources should be divided. Under those conditions, fear became remarkably practical. People worried less about extraordinary disasters than about familiar ones arriving at the worst possible moment. Another harsh winter, another sickness, another predator emerging from the woods. Anxiety did not exist apart from everyday life. It became woven into it. It attaches itself to anything that might threaten what little stability remains. The forest, in that world, was not simply a place. It was a boundary. A place where order thinned, where the rules that governed the village did not quite hold. People entered it when they had to, not when they wanted to. To gather wood, to hunt, to travel, but always with the understanding that they were stepping into something less predictable than the life they had built outside of it. Wolves belonged to that space. They were not mythical. They were seen, heard, tracked. Their presence was part of the landscape. But familiarity did not make them less feared. If anything, it made the fear sharper. Because wolves did not behave like chaos. They behaved like intent. They watched, they followed, they waited. And when winter pressed hard enough, when food became scarce enough, they came closer. Closer to roads, closer to livestock, closer to people, and eventually, closer to children. This matters, because when the attacks near Dole began, the explanation did not have to be invented. It already existed. European werewolf trials did not erupt from nowhere. They emerged from a culture already steeped in old stories of transformation. Classical mythology gave one inheritance, especially the legend of Lycaon. The king transformed into the wolf after an act of profane brutality. Medieval folklore gave another, filling the continent with tales of shapeshifters, curses, enchanted skins, and people caught between human and animal form. But by the early modern period, those stories had grown teeth in the courtroom. Accusations of werewolfery were increasingly linked to witchcraft, satanic influence, and cannibal violence. The idea had shifted from legend to prosecution. France, in particular, became a crucible for these trials. Researchers note that the country saw dozens of werewolf cases, especially in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Some of the accused were children. Some were wanderers. Some were social outsiders. Some may have been mentally ill. Some may have been murderers. Some were likely whatever frightened neighbors needed them to be. Even in modern scholarship, the numbers are difficult to pin down precisely, because the records are scattered and often filtered through demonologists, judges, pamphleteers, and later retellings with their own agendas. What remains consistent is the atmosphere. Fear was not an accessory to these trials. It was their... That atmosphere stepped Gilles Garnier, a man already well positioned to become a suspect before anyone ever called him a wolf. He was a hermit, or near enough to one, a recluse, a man living at the edges, outside the reassuring rhythms of ordinary village life. Accounts placed him around Saint-Benoît, near Amange, in the region of Franche-Comté, not far from Dole. He was associated with the wilderness more than with the town, and that matters. In almost every age, people are less afraid of violence committed by those they understand than by those who remain unreadable. A hermit does not merely live alone. He lives beyond explanation. He has a blank space others can fill. Very little is known about Garnier before his arrest, and that silence is part of what makes him so difficult to understand today. The surviving records are interested almost exclusively in the accusations that followed, not in the ordinary details of his life beforehand. We do not know much about his childhood, his family, or the experiences that shaped him into adulthood. We meet him only at the moment history decided he mattered, and history rarely introduces people at their most ordinary. What does emerge is the image of a man living beyond the familiar rhythms of village life. He and his wife occupied a modest dwelling near the forest, surviving as best they could on the margins of society. Whether that isolation was chosen, imposed by circumstance, or simply the result of poverty is impossible to determine. But isolation has always had a way of inviting. The less a community understands someone, the easier it becomes to imagine the worst when a tragedy arrives. There is a particular vulnerability in being unknown in a world that depends on familiarity. In small communities, identity is not something abstract. It is built through repetition, through shared labor, shared spaces, shared routines. People know where you belong because they have seen you belong somewhere. They know your history because they have watched it unfold. Garnier did not fit into that structure. He existed near it, but not within it. In communities built on familiarity, existing outside those shared routines was often enough to make someone visible long before it made them guilty. Because when something begins to go wrong, when something disrupts the expected order of life, suspicion does not spread evenly. It settles instead, looking for a place to land. And it almost always lands on the person who cannot easily defend themselves against it. The person no one fully understands. The person who already exists slightly outside the boundary. In another time, in another place, that might have made Garnier forgettable. In this moment, it made him visible. Nothing about Gilles Garnier made him a murderer. Nothing about his isolated life proved he was dangerous. At this point in the story, he was simply another man living at the edge of a society that rarely paid much attention to those on its margins. But history has a habit of transforming ordinary details into ominous foreshadowing. Once a name becomes attached to horror, every earlier choice begins to look like the beginning of an inevitable descent. The forest no longer seems like a home. It becomes a hiding place. Solitude no longer suggests privacy. It suggests secrecy. None of those interpretations existed yet. They would come later. First came the killings. And then the children began to die. The record that survives around the killings is grim, incomplete, and tangled in retellings. But the broad outline is horrifyingly clear. In the early 1570s, several children in the countryside near Dole were attacked, mutilated, and according to the charges later brought against Garnier, partially eaten. The victims were young. The violence was intimate and bestial. Witnesses and later accounts described children being dragged into fields or vineyards, clawed, bitten, torn open, and stripped of flesh. This was the kind of brutality that did not stay private. It spread from household to household, from path to market, from rumor to proclamation. A dead child can shatter a family. Several dead children can destabilize an entire region. What made these attacks particularly terrifying was not simply their brutality, but their apparent unpredictability. There was no obvious pattern the families could avoid. The victims were not soldiers traveling dangerous roads or hunters venturing deep into unfamiliar forests. They were children, moving through landscapes that should have felt ordinary. A path between neighboring farms, a vineyard, the edge of a field. Places where daily life unfolded with enough familiarity that danger was never expected to arrive so suddenly. Every new attack reshaped those ordinary places. Parents who had once thought little of sending children to gather wood or carry supplies suddenly began accompanying them. Journeys that had once taken place without discussion became matters of careful planning. Work in the fields ended earlier. Travelers hurried home before dusk. The geography itself began to change, not because the roads had moved, but because fear had redrawn the boundaries of where people believed it was safe to go. There's a difference between hearing about violence and encountering it. A story can be held at a distance. A body cannot. Imagine a village waiting for a child who should already be home. At first, there is no panic. A delayed errand is hardly unusual. Perhaps they stopped to speak with neighbors. Perhaps they wandered after something that caught their attention. Someone volunteers to walk the road and look for them. Then another joins. Before long, several people are calling a name into the growing evening, expecting an answer that never comes. Searches like these rarely begin with the expectation of discovering violence. They begin with hope. Hope that a child has simply lost track of time. Hope that darkness has delayed the journey home. Hope that tomorrow morning everyone will laugh about unnecessary worry. It is only when those hopes begin to disappear that something far more frightening settles over a community. When the body is finally found, the search ends, but the uncertainty does not. Instead, it grows. The familiar landscape is suddenly transformed into a crime scene. Every broken branch becomes meaningful. Every footprint seems important. Every distant sound carries new significance. The place where children once played becomes a place people avoid looking toward at all. When the body is found, the violence is no longer abstract. It is visible. It is undeniable. It is structured in a way that feels deliberate, even if no intention can yet be proven. And that is where fear begins to evolve. Because a single act of violence can be explained. But repetition suggests something else. Something that is choosing. We should be careful here. The surviving details come to us through legal summaries, later interpretations, and retellings shaped by the expectations of their age. Exact dates sometimes shift. Sequence and wording vary. What one source states as certainty, another gives as tradition. Still, the case consistently centers on a series of child attacks severe enough to provoke public alarm and an official response. Authorities in the region issued an edict encouraging people to apprehend, and in some accounts to kill, the creature or killer responsible. That response itself tells us how serious the panic had become. This was no isolated whisper on the edge of the woods. It had become a communal crisis. Local officials could not afford the appearance of inaction. Communities expected protection, even when no obvious means of providing it existed. Orders were issued encouraging people to remain vigilant, and surviving accounts describe efforts to locate or destroy whatever was responsible. Whether those searches focused on wolves, a human attacker, or something people struggled to categorize likely varied from village to village. What remained constant was the growing pressure to produce an answer. The longer the attacks continued without resolution, the more dangerous uncertainty itself became. Every failed search encouraged fresh rumors. Every rumor generated new suspicions. Fear rarely overwhelms a community all at once. It accumulates through repetition. One family experiences tragedy, then another. Conversations that begin in whisper gradually become impossible to avoid. Markets, churches, and village roads all fill with the same uneasy question. Have you heard what happened? Did you hear where they found the body? Has anyone seen the creature responsible? Eventually, people stop discussing what has already happened and begin anticipating what will happen next. Parents change routines before danger appears. Travelers avoid roads where nothing has yet occurred. Children inherit fears they have not personally experienced because the adults around them can no longer hide their own. By that point, the violence has expanded beyond its victims. It has begun reorganizing the behavior of an entire community. At first, as in so many of these cases, the simplest explanation would have been a wolf. Wolves were known threats. Children were vulnerable. A savage attack in the countryside could be explained by nature, however cruel that nature might be. But as reports accumulated, that explanation appears to have become unstable. At first, suspicion remained fixed on the animal itself. Wolves were hunted, tracks were examined, and people searched the surrounding countryside for some tangible explanation that could restore a sense of order. But each unsuccessful search made the purely natural explanation harder for frightened communities to accept. The attacks felt too deliberate, too persistent, too personal. Gradually, conversations began shifting away from what had done this toward who might have done it. The violence looked too deliberate. The pattern felt wrong. And eventually, witnesses claimed to have seen not simply an animal, but something that unsettled them more. A figure moving between categories. One of the most repeated moments in the case involves laborers or passerbys encountering what seemed to be a wolf near the body of a child, only to recognize in that creature, or near that scene, the hermit Gilles Garnier. Whether that recognition was immediate, uncertain, or later amplified by collective fear, it became the hinge on which the case turned. It is impossible to know today exactly what those witnesses believed they had seen in the moment itself. Human memory is remarkably vulnerable during periods of fear, particularly when communities begin sharing stories with one another. A glimpse of movement between trees, an indistinct figure fleeing across a field, or a wolf disappearing into nearby brush can all become transformed through repetition into something much more certain. And by the time testimony reaches a courtroom, uncertainty often disappears from the story entirely, replaced by confidence that may not have existed in the beginning. Once suspicion attached itself to Garnier, it did not remain an accusation of murder alone. It began to gather folklore around it like thorns catching cloth. A predator in the fields became a werewolf in the court's imagination. Once Garnier's name entered the conversation, every unanswered question suddenly appeared to have an answer. His isolation explained why no one knew him well. His home near the forest explained his proximity to the attacks. His unfamiliar habits became suspicious simply because they were unfamiliar. Piece by piece, details that had once existed independently began fitting together into a single narrative. That narrative did more than identify a suspect. It transformed the nature of the crimes themselves. A wolf could explain torn flesh. A murderer could explain intention. But a werewolf explained both at once. It preserved the reality of the attacks while relocating their cause somewhere between the human and the supernatural. For a frightened community struggling to understand unimaginable violence, that explanation possessed a terrible kind of logic. Once that idea took hold, the outcome of the investigation was never going to be determined by evidence alone. It would also be shaped by belief. And belief was about to find its voice in a confession. After his arrest, Gilles Garnier confessed. Before confession becomes a document, it is a moment. A room, a process. We do not know exactly what that room looked like, but we understand the structure well enough to imagine its pressure. An accused man, already marked by suspicion. Authorities who are not searching blindly, but moving toward a conclusion they already believe is within reach. Questions that are not neutral, but directional. They do not ask what happened in an open sense. They ask in a way that narrows possibility. Did you see something in the forest? Did something approach you? Did you accept it? Did you change? Each answer does not open the story. It closes it, guiding it towards something recognizable. And in that environment, resistance is not simply difficult. It is unstable. Because the longer uncertainty remains, the more dangerous it becomes for the accused. A confession, even a constructed one, can become the safest available path. Not to truth, but to an ending. That does not mean every confession produced under pressure was entirely invented. People often confess using fragments of truth woven together with the expectations placed upon them. A frightened suspect may acknowledge real actions while adopting explanations suggested by investigators. Others may begin repeating stories they had heard so often that they no longer recognize where their own memories end and the community's expectations begin. Confessions are rarely simple documents. They are conversations shaped by unequal power, cultural assumptions, and the desperate human desire for uncertainty to come to an end. That complexity hangs over every surviving count of Gilles Garnier. The words preserved in legal records are not simply the words of one man. They are the product of an entire system asking questions that already assumed certain answers were possible. That much is central to the case, and that much is also exactly where the case becomes most unstable. According to the surviving accounts, Garnier said that while wandering in the forest in search of food, desperate to feed himself and his wife, he encountered a dark figure, or specter, who offered him a means to hunt more effectively. In some tellings, this figure is plainly demonic. In others, it remains more ambiguous, but never harmless. That being gave him an ointment. Encounters like this appear with remarkable consistency throughout European witchcraft and werewolf trials. The details vary from case to case, but the structure remains familiar. An isolated individual enters a liminal space, often a forest or a lonely road. They encounter a mysterious figure whose identity is never entirely stable. Sometimes it's described as the devil, sometimes a dark stranger, sometimes a spirit whose nature remains uncertain. What follows is always an offer, a bargain, or a gift that promises to change the person forever. To modern readers, those similarities may suggest literary convention more than lived experience. They resemble stories that were already circulating throughout Europe, stories that judges, clergy, and ordinary villagers would have recognized long before Garnier ever stood trial. That does not tell us whether the encounter happened. It tells us that if someone wished to describe becoming a werewolf in 16th century France, this was already the language available to them. The detail of the ointment appears in multiple werewolf cases across Europe, and its persistence is not accidental. It functions as a bridge, something physical that allows the transformation to feel grounded, not purely spiritual, not purely imaginary, but enacted, applied, initiated through contact with the body. In a world where medicine, superstition, and ritual often overlapped, substances carried meaning beyond their material properties. Oils, salves, mixtures, these were not just tools, they were mechanisms through which change could be understood. The ointment in Garnier's confession does not need to be real to be effective. It only needs to make the transformation believable. It answers a question the court would inevitably ask. How does a man become something else? It is striking how often supernatural beliefs attempt to solve practical questions with tangible objects. Witches required broomsticks, charms, or ritual tools. Alchemists searched for physical substances capable of producing extraordinary transformations. Even miracles were frequently associated with relics, holy water, or sacred oils. Material objects offered reassurance because they gave invisible forces visible expression. If a man truly became a wolf, there had to be a mechanism through which that impossible change occurred. The ointment served exactly that purpose. Whether it existed within the confession or reflected ideas Garnier genuinely believed, it transformed an otherwise impossible claim into something that felt procedurally understandable. Apply the salve, enter the forest, become the beast. By using it, Garnier claimed he could transform into a wolf, or into a wolf-like state, and so acquire the speed and power needed to seize prey. Under this condition, he said, he attacked and killed children, tearing them apart and devouring their flesh. The image is so complete, so symbolically perfect, that it almost feels designed for preservation. A poor outsider, a forest encounter, a supernatural bargain, magical ointment, child victims, cannibal appetite, transformation. It contains every ingredient an age of demonology would recognize. It is not just a confession, it is a confession already dressed for legend. Read today, the confession possesses an almost theatrical quality. Every element appears exactly where later generations would expect it to be. The lonely hermit, the desperate hunger, the mysterious stranger, the magical transformation, the murdered children. It unfolds less like spontaneous testimony and more like a story whose narrative structure had already existed long before the accused ever repeated it. That observation should make us cautious, but not dismissive. Stories shape memory in ways that are often invisible to the people telling them. If Garnier committed these crimes, his own understanding of what he had done may already have been filtered through the folklore surrounding him. If he did not, then the court may have supplied that folklore as the framework through which his confession eventually emerged. Either possibility leaves us with the same problem. We possess a story that has been shaped by belief at every stage of its preservation. And that is precisely why it must be approached with caution. Modern historians emphasize that many accused werewolves confessed only under torture or coercive legal conditions, and Garnier is often understood within that pattern. The courts of the period did not seek truth the way we flatter ourselves into imagining modern systems do. They sought coherence. They sought an answer that aligned the crime, the suspect, and the worldview of the people judging him. Under such conditions, a confession was often not unveiling of an inner reality but the forced construction of a narrative the court already knew how to hear. Under such conditions, confession was often not the unveiling of an inner reality but the forced construction of a narrative the court already knew how to hear. That does not necessarily mean Garnier was innocent. It means the surviving story of his guilt has been filtered through methods that make certainty impossible. Historians face an unusual challenge when studying cases like this. Their surviving documents often tell us far more about the people conducting the trial than the individual standing accused. Judges recorded what interested judges. Clergy emphasized what confirmed religious belief. Later writers frequently embellished details that made the story more compelling for new audiences. Every generation inherited the case through the priorities of the generation before it. Untangling those layers is extraordinarily difficult, especially when so few records survive from Garnier's own perspective. Some historians and writers suggest he may indeed have been a killer, perhaps one driven by severe psychological disturbance, profound deprivation, or compulsive violence. History's survey of werewolf trials leaves room for that possibility. Even the more cautious accounts acknowledge that among the falsely accused, the delusional, and the socially abandoned, there may have also been genuine murderers. In that sense, Garnier haunts the record because he resists easy rescue. He cannot be cleanly transformed into a martyr of superstition without erasing the dead. Neither can he be accepted at face value as a literal werewolf or as a straightforward criminal case supported by modern standards of evidence. He remains trapped in the very ambiguity that made him famous. There was another possibility as well, one less dramatic but perhaps more disturbing. Garnier may have believed at least in part, what he confessed. The modern psychiatric term lycanthropy refers to a delusional condition in which a person believes they are transforming, or have transformed, into an animal, often a wolf. It is rare, and we cannot diagnose a 16th century man across centuries of distortion. But the existence of such a syndrome reminds us that belief and brutality do not cancel one another. A person can be both mentally fractured and deadly. A confession can be both sincere and false in different ways. A man can believe he is a beast without ever having been one. Cases of clinical lycanthropy remain exceptionally rare, but they illustrate an important point. Human beings do not merely experience reality. They interpret it through whatever cultural vocabulary is available to them. Today, someone suffering profound psychological disturbance might describe surveillance, implanted devices, or elaborate conspiracies. A person living in 16th century France possessed a very different symbolic language. Demons, witches, possession, curses, and transformation offered frameworks through which experiences that defied ordinary explanation could still be understood. That does not mean those frameworks were objectively true. It means they were psychologically available. The courtroom was never designed to preserve uncertainty. It existed to resolve it. Whether that resolution reflected reality as it truly happened was, in many cases, a secondary concern. Communities demanded answers. Families demanded justice. Authorities demanded order. The legal process was expected to provide all three, even when certainty remained frustratingly out of reach. By the time Garnier's confession had been recorded, the trial had already possessed everything it needed. A series of horrifying crimes, a suspect who lived beyond the boundaries of ordinary society, a confession that explained the impossible through language the court readily understood. The remaining question was no longer whether that explanation was correct. It was whether anyone still needed it to be. Judgment would follow soon enough. Gilles Garnier was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning. By the time the court delivered its judgment, the case had gathered nearly every element required to make conviction feel inevitable. Children had been killed. Witnesses claimed to have connected Garnier to the attacks. A frightened population had already accepted that something unnatural was moving through the countryside. Most decisively, Garnier had confessed not merely to murder, but to transformation, describing a supernatural encounter, a magical ointment, and a series of killings committed while occupying the body or condition of a wolf. Whatever uncertainty may have existed at the beginning of the investigation had been pressed into a narrative that the court could recognize and punish. The charges did not separate murder, witchcraft, cannibalism, and lycanthropy into distinct categories. They bound them together. To the court, these were not competing explanations for the same behavior, but different expressions of a single corruption. Garnier had not merely killed. He had violated the boundaries that made human society comprehensible. He had crossed between man and animal, Christian and damned, hunger and depravity. The deaths of the children were therefore treated not only as crimes against individual victims, but as evidence of a wider moral infection, something capable of contaminating the order of the community itself. This fusion of criminal and supernatural belief can look incoherent from a modern distance, but it belonged to a legal world that did not draw the same boundaries as we do. A person could be accused of causing physical harm through spiritual corruption because the two were not understood as mutually exclusive. A demonic bargain might explain criminal intention. An enchanted substance might explain otherwise impossible behavior. A confession to becoming a wolf could be treated as evidence because the court already accepted transformation as a conceivable consequence of witchcraft. Within that framework, Garnier's supernatural claims did not weaken the prosecution, they completed it. His sentence also carried meaning beyond the simple removal of a convicted killer. Burning was a public declaration that the thing threatening the community had been identified and destroyed. Fire did not merely kill, it purified, erased, and reduced the condemned body to something that could no longer conceal corruption. In the symbolic language of the period, The execution promised more than death. It promised cleansing. The body associated with transformation would itself be transformed, stripped of human shape, and reduced to ash before the people whose fear had demanded an ending. Public punishment was designed to be witnessed because authority needed justice to become visible. Private death might remove the accused, but it could not communicate the same message. An execution performed before the community allowed the state to demonstrate that it remained capable of imposing order upon forces that had appeared to escape it. The attacks had made fields, roads, and vineyards feel unsafe. They had exposed the limits of local protection and allowed terror to spread faster than any official answer. Garnier's death offered a reversal. The community would no longer watch helplessly while something hunted its children. It would watch while the accused predator was consumed. That spectacle did not require every observer to understand the case in precisely the same way. Some may have believed that they were witnessing the destruction of a literal werewolf. Others may have regarded Garnier as a murderer who had entered into a demonic pact. Some may simply have believed that the man responsible for the attacks was finally getting punished. Public rituals succeed partly because they allow different interpretations to gather around the same event. Whatever people believed Garnier had been, the fire announced that he no longer posed a threat. The location of the prosecution is revealing as well. Werewolf cases were not exclusively the work of distant religious authorities or the machinery of the Inquisition. Many were handled by secular and local courts responsible for maintaining civic order. Garnier's condemnation, therefore, cannot be dismissed as theological paranoia acting entirely apart from ordinary governance. The fear surrounding him was religious, but it was also administrative, communal, and immediate. Children had died within the jurisdiction of earthly authorities, and those authorities were expected to provide an answer capable of restoring confidence. That expectation placed enormous pressure upon the legal process. A court that failed to identify the source of the attacks risked appearing powerless. A community unable to explain the violence would remain trapped in anticipation of its return. Once Garnier had been arrested and his confession recorded, too many needs converged around his guilt for ambiguity to remain useful. The families of the victims needed justice. Officials needed resolution. Villagers needed reassurance that the danger had been contained. The werewolf explanation provided all three while also giving the crimes a form that matched the terror they had produced. Surviving versions of the case sometimes claim that more than 50 witnesses testified against Garnier or connected him in some way to the attacks. Such a number sounds overwhelming, especially when viewed as a simple measurement of corroboration. 50 witnesses appear to offer 50 independent confirmations, each strengthening the last until doubt becomes unreasonable. But collective testimony rarely operates so cleanly, particularly within a frightened community where stories have circulated long before they enter the courtroom. Witnesses do not experience events in isolation from one another. They speak with neighbors, hear rumors, absorb official accusations, and revisit uncertain memories after learning what others claim to have seen. A fleeting movement near the trees may become a wolf after someone else reports a wolf. A distant human figure may become Garnier after Garnier's name enters public suspicion. Details that once felt uncertain begin to align, not necessarily because people are deliberately lying, but because shared fear teaches them how the event is supposed to be remembered. Memory becomes social. Possibility hardens into recognition. Recognition eventually returns to the court as certainty. This does not mean every witness was mistaken or that the entire case emerged from invention. Something terrible happened in the countryside around Dole. Children were dead, their bodies bearing evidence of profound violence. No amount of skepticism toward the supernatural elements can erase the events that set the accusation in motion. That is what prevents Garnier's story from becoming a simple account of innocent outsider destroyed by superstition. The folklore surrounding the case may have distorted the investigation, but distortion requires something to distort. Beneath the werewolf, the ointment, the specter, and the language of demonic corruption remain the unresolved fact of the killings themselves. Perhaps Garnier committed them and confessed through the only framework his interrogators would accept. Perhaps he was severely disturbed and genuinely interpreted his actions as transformation. Perhaps his confession was shaped by pressure until real crimes and supernatural expectations became impossible to separate. It is also possible that the community gathered multiple attacks, conflicting testimony, and years of fear around one isolated man because a single culprit offered the cleanest path out of chaos. The surviving record allows each possibility to remain visible, but it does not provide enough reliable evidence to choose among them with confidence. The court did not have the luxury, or perhaps the desire, to preserve those possibilities. Courts exist to move towards judgment. They turn accusation into guilt or acquittal, uncertainty into decision, and social disorder into an official account of what occurred. History can tolerate unresolved questions for centuries. A frightened community cannot always tolerate them through another winter. Garnier's conviction created an ending where the evidence alone may not have been capable of producing one. Then came the fire. Whatever Garnier thought as he approached his execution is absent from the records that survive. We do not know whether he maintained the supernatural elements of his confession, withdrew them, prayed, protested, or entered the final moments of his life too exhausted to offer anything further. The records preserve the sentence because the sentence mattered to the authorities. They preserve the accusations because the accusations justified the punishment. The inner life of the condemned man was less important than the public meaning of his death. When the execution was complete, the community possessed something it had not possessed during the attacks: a conclusion. The predator had been named. The werewolf had been destroyed. The court had acted. The sentence had been carried out, and the immediate crisis could be placed behind them. Whether new attacks ceased because the guilty man was dead, because unrelated violence had already ended, or because later events were no longer interpreted through the same panic cannot be established. What mattered was that the absence of further horror could now be folded into the official story as proof that the correct monster had been found. That is how verdicts begin changing memory. Before the conviction, the killings existed as a collection of frightening and uncertain events. Afterward, each event could be reorganized around Garnier. The strange shape glimpsed near a field became evidence of a transformation. The hermit's isolation became evidence of concealment. Hunger became motive. The forest became hunting ground. The confession became explanation. Everything that had once been disconnected acquired a place within a single sequence, and anything that did not fit could gradually be forgotten. Over time, the case became easier to tell precisely because its uncertainties were worn away. A community had been terrorized. A hermit had become a wolf. Children had been killed. The authorities had discovered the truth and destroyed the creature responsible. The story possessed a beginning, an escalation, a monster, and a punishment. It offered horror, but it also offered order. That completeness helped it survive long after the details, capable of complicating it, had faded. Fire created the appearance of finality, but it could not settle the questions buried inside the case. It ended Garnier's life without proving exactly what kind of life had ended. It removed the accused without determining whether the court had uncovered a murderer, constructed a werewolf, or done both at once. The execution gave the people of Dole an answer strong enough to live with, while leaving history with a story too unstable to fully believe. The man was gone, but the version of him created by that trial had only begun to live. The story of Gilles Garnier survives because it sits at the crossroads of several different kinds of fear, and each of them still speaks. At the surface level, the case is about the oldest terror in European folklore, the fear of transformation. The werewolf is frightening not because it is simply a wolf, but because it is a person crossing into appetite without restraint. It is the body made treacherous. Civilization stripped away. Conscience devoured from within. In that sense, the werewolf has always been a myth about instability. It asks the question polite society keeps trying to bury. How thin is the membrane between the human being and the predator? But on a historical level, Garnier's case also reveals how often societies create monsters from people already standing at the margins. Historians of European werewolf trials note the recurring profile: beggars, hermits, migrants, isolated figures, people whose social strangeness made them easier to imagine as morally or spiritually corrupted. When communities suffer under harsh conditions, they become ravenous for explanation. Scapegoats offer shapes to chaos. They convert random horror into a story with a target. In that way, the werewolf trial is not just a superstition, it is a social technology. It tells frightened people where the point. At the same time, Garnier may not fit cleanly into the role of innocent victim of panic. That is what makes this case stronger, darker, and more difficult than a simple wrongful accusation narrative. If he killed those children, then the folklore did not invent the horror. It interpreted it. It gave it a language available to the of a modern vocabulary of psychopathy, compulsion, delusion, paraphilia, famine-driven desperation, or severe mental disturbance. The court used the words it had: wolf, witchcraft, devil, beast. The danger in looking back is assuming that because their categories were supernatural, the human violence underneath them was unreal. Sometimes the myth hides the crime. Sometimes it is the crime's chosen costume. It is striking how modern the underlying problem actually is. Today we still struggle to understand individuals who commit repeated acts of apparently motiveless violence. We have replaced demonology with psychology, witchcraft with psychiatry, and lycanthropy with behavioral profiling. But the deeper question has remained remarkably consistent. How does a human being become capable of acts that seem to violate our assumptions about humanity itself? The language has changed dramatically over 5 centuries. The mystery has not. This is where the modern concept of clinical lycanthropy becomes intriguing, not as a diagnosis but as a window into human possibility. A person may sincerely believe they are becoming an animal. Delusions do not make violence impossible. They can structure it. The mind can reinterpret appetite, rage, shame, and dissociation through whatever symbols a culture provides. There is a tendency, especially when looking backward, to assume that earlier societies misunderstood what they were seeing in ways that modern thinking has corrected. That assumption creates a kind of distance, a sense that what had happened here can be explained away as ignorance rather than examined as interpretation. But that distance collapses quickly when the details are allowed to settle. The people involved in cases like this were not simply observing behavior. They were trying to make sense of it within a framework that could hold it together. The werewolf, in that context, was not just a mistake. It was an answer that felt complete enough to survive. One of the reasons cases like Garnier's remain so compelling is that they remind us how deeply human experience depends upon interpretation. Psychological suffering does not arrive already labeled. It must be understood through whatever symbols a culture has available. Today, a person experiencing profound delusions might describe government surveillance, implanted technology, or elaborate conspiracies. A 16th century French peasant lived inside an entirely different symbolic landscape. Demons, witchcraft, divine punishment, possession, and transformation offered ready-made explanations for experiences that otherwise resisted language. That does not mean these explanations were objectively true. It means they were psychologically accessible. The mind reaches for concepts it already knows when trying to explain what it cannot bear to experience directly. Because what people in Dole were confronting was not merely murder. They were confronting repeated violence that seemed to violate every expectation they held about ordinary human behavior. The victims were children. The attacks appeared deliberate. The brutality felt excessive even by the standards of an often brutal century. Faced with that reality, the question naturally shifted from who would do this to What could do this? The werewolf answered that second question in a way ordinary criminality could not. That is one of the enduring functions of monsters throughout history. They allow societies to acknowledge horrifying acts without fully accepting those acts as expressions of ordinary humanity. Violence is not denied, it is relocated. Moved just beyond the boundary of the human while remaining close enough to explain the evidence left behind. The werewolf becomes a compromise between recognition and denial. It preserved the reality of the crime while protecting the belief that such crimes belong to something other than ourselves. In a medieval or early modern Christian world full of wolves, demons, and enchanted ointments, the experience of psychological fracture may not announce itself as illness. It might announce itself as metamorphosis. Hunger, in this context, becomes more than a physical condition. It becomes a narrative device that bridges the gap between the human and the monstrous. A starving man is already positioned at the edge of acceptable behavior. Not because hunger justifies violence, but because it erodes the structures that typically prevent it. It introduces desperation. It narrows decision-making. It reduces the distance between impulse and action. In a society where survival was never guaranteed, hunger was not an abstract concept. It was an ever-present possibility, one that could reshape a person's relationship to the world in ways that were difficult to fully predict. Throughout European folklore, hunger repeatedly functions as a force that erodes identity. Famines produce stories of cannibalism, revenants, witches stealing food, and creatures driven by insatiable appetite. These stories are not simply about starvation. They are about the fear that deprivation changes people in ways that cannot easily be reversed. A starving body thinks differently than a comfortable one. Moral certainty begins giving way to survival. Decisions once considered unthinkable become imaginable. Folklore often dramatizes that transformation through monsters because monsters provide visible shapes for invisible desperation. That does not mean hunger created Garnier's crimes, if he committed them. But it does help explain why his confession centered so heavily on appetite. The wolf was not simply stronger than a man. It was hungrier than a man. With the symbolic world of 16th century France, that distinction mattered. Hunger became the bridge connecting ordinary deprivation to extraordinary violence. When that condition is combined with isolation, suspicion, and the escalating panic of a community already searching for an explanation, it creates a situation where the line between circumstance and identity begins to blur. Garnier is no longer just a man who may have committed acts of violence. He becomes a figure through which those acts are interpreted. His hunger is no longer just his own. It becomes symbolic. It becomes representative of something larger, something that can be named, contained, and ultimately condemned in a way that feels more complete than acknowledging the instability of human behavior itself. Stories survive for reasons that history alone cannot explain. They survive because they possess structure, a beginning that invites curiosity, a mystery that demands resolution, a monster that concentrates fear, an ending that appears to restore order. Garnier's case contains every one of those elements. Whether each detail happened exactly as remembered becomes almost secondary once the narrative itself achieves coherence. That is why this case endured, while countless equally tragic crimes disappeared from the historical record. History preserves many murders. It preserves far fewer transformations. The image of the hermit becoming a wolf proved more durable than any legal document because images travel farther than evidence. Long after the witnesses died and the court's records faded into archives, the story retained a shape people could still remember. This is part of why stories like Garnier's endure when so many other cases disappear into obscurity. The details themselves are horrific, but not unique in a purely historical sense. Violence, even extreme violence, has occurred in many forms across many periods. What makes this case persistent is the way it was framed. It was not recorded simply as a crime. It was recorded as a transformation, and transformation is easier to remember than motive. It is easier to pass down, easier to retell, easier to adapt to new audiences who may no longer believe in the literal possibility, but still respond to the underlying tension it represents. And even with all of that, the case refuses to settle into anything final, because every attempt to define it collapses into the same problem. If we treat Garnier as a literal monster, we accept an explanation that removes the violence from the realm of the human entirely. If we treat him as purely a victim of panic, we risk ignoring the very real possibility that something brutal and deliberate did occur. If we attempt to separate the crime from the story, we are left with fragments that no longer fully explain one another. What remains is not a clean answer, but a tension. A recognition that the story has survived not because it is resolved, but because it is unresolved in a way that continues to feel meaningful. It allows each generation to approach it with its own framework, its own language, its own assumptions about what is possible and what is not. And in doing so, it continues to evolve without ever fully detaching from its origin. So what was Gilles Garnier? A murderer whose crimes became inseparable from folklore? A man suffering from profound psychological disturbance whose century interpreted delusion as transformation? A scapegoat shaped by panic around acts of genuine violence? Or a case in which all of those possibilities became so tightly woven together that history could no longer separate them? The most honest answer may also be the least satisfying. Gilles Garnier was not simply preserved as a monster. He was preserved as a human being whose story was translated into monstrous language. And perhaps that is why it still refuses to disappear. The fire that kills Gilles Garnier was meant to do what fire always promises in these stories: cleanse the village, end the fear, draw a bright line between the human world and the thing that had violated it. But the line never stayed bright for long. The image of the werewolf has survived for centuries, not because people continued believing men literally transformed into wolves, but because the story continued asking questions that never became obsolete. How does a community explain extraordinary violence? How much do fear and expectation shape memory? When does a confession reveal reality? And when does it reveal the beliefs of the people demanding it? Those questions outlived belief in werewolves themselves. By the time Gilles Garnier died, the court had its answers. The villages had theirs. The story had already chosen its form. A hermit, a killer, a wolf. History, however, is rarely satisfied with the conclusions reached by courts. Legal systems exist to deliver verdicts. Historical inquiry exists to revisit them. Over the centuries, Garnier's trial has been examined by folklorists, historians, psychologists, and students of religion, each approaching the same case with a different vocabulary and a different set of questions. None have fully dissolved the uncertainty. Instead, each has exposed another layer beneath the one that came before. The deeper the story is examined, the less it resembles a simple tale of a werewolf, and the more it becomes a study of how fear, violence, belief, and memory shape one another. But centuries later, what remains is not certainty. What remains is a collection of fragments that refuse to assemble into a single, unquestionable truth. Dead children in the fields, witnesses whose memories may have shifted beneath the weight of communal fear, a confession shaped by interrogation, folklore, or genuine belief, perhaps all at once. A hermit living beyond the edges of ordinary society. A court determined to restore order. Each fragment appears meaningful on its own. Together they create a picture that is strangely complete, while remaining fundamentally unresolved. And that may be why the story continues to hold its shape. Because the most unsettling possibility is not that a man once became a wolf. The most unsettling possibility is that the story never truly required. It is that people looked at one another in a frightened and broken world and found that explanation easier to live with than the truth.